All right, in this video, I would like to come up with a formula for the derivative of the cosine function. So what we want to do is determine what is the derivative, d dx, of cosine of x. Okay, so we'll use the limit definition of the derivative. So the derivative of cosine of x should be the limit as delta x approaches 0 of the cosine of x plus delta x minus the cosine of x, all divided by delta x. We're applying our limit definition of the derivative, where f prime of x is equal to the limit as delta x goes to 0 of f of x plus delta x minus f of x all over delta x. So in this case, f of x is cosine of x. Okay, so we can use the sum formula for cosine, where the cosine of a plus b is equal to the cosine of a times the cosine of b minus the sine of a times the sine of b. So in this case, a is the x and b is the delta x. Okay, so this should be equal to the limit as delta x goes to 0 of cosine x times cosine delta x minus the sine of x times the sine of delta x. Okay, and then we have a minus cosine of x. That we'll put at the end, minus cosine of x. And that's all divided by delta x. Okay, so we have a cosine of x here and a cosine of x here. So let's group those two terms together. So we have the limit as delta x goes to 0. And let's actually split this fraction up into two fractions. So we have the cosine of x times the cosine of delta x, it's the first term, minus cosine of x. And that's all over delta x. So we're taking the limit of this difference. So minus, okay, so now we have the sine of x times the sine of delta x, all divided by delta x. Okay, so now this is starting to resemble our two special limit formulas, one for the sine, one for the cosine. So we have the limit as theta goes to 0 of 1 minus cosine theta over theta is equal to 0. And the limit as theta goes to 0 of sine theta over theta, and that is equal to 1. Okay, so this one is the one on the left. The cosine limit is resembling this term, and the sine limit is resembling this term. Okay, so now back to the derivative, the limit as delta x goes to 0. Well, it's delta x goes to 0. So this limit has nothing to do with the cosine of x. It's only affecting the cosine of delta x. So we could factor out that cosine of x. And actually, let me erase this limit. Since the limit isn't affecting the cosine x, we could factor that cosine of x outside of the limit. Limit as delta x goes to 0. And actually, if we want to make this sort of fit exactly the form of this limit, we'll factor out a negative cosine of x. Okay, so then we'll have 1 minus cosine of delta x over delta x So let's use parentheses. And then we have minus. And the same thing, we could factor out the sine from the limit. So sine of x, we'll factor out the sine x from the limit. So sine of x times the limit as delta x goes to 0 of sine of delta x over delta x. Okay, so we can now evaluate each of these two limits using these formulas. So we have negative cosine of x times 0, the value of this first limit, minus the sine of x times 1, the value of the second limit. Okay, negative cosine of x times 0 is 0. Sine of x times 1 is sine of x. So we have the negative sine of x as our derivative of the cosine function. So if f of x is equal to the cosine of x, then the derivative is equal to negative sine of x. And that is our derivative formula for the cosine function.